Walk down any street in a major city today and you're surrounded by electric lights. Street lamps, neon signs, illuminated storefronts. It's so mundane, so ordinary that we don't give it a second thought. But what if I told you that this technology, which we consider barely more than a century old, might have actually existed much earlier than we've been led to believe? What if the cities of the 1850s weren't dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, but blazed with the same electric brilliance we know today? The official story is simple and neat. In the mid-19th century, cities around the world relied on gas lighting for their streets and homes. It was dirty, dangerous, and dim, but it was the best technology available. Then came Edison and his contemporaries in the 1880s, and suddenly the world was transformed by the miracle of electric light. A clear linear progression from primitive to advanced, from darkness to illumination. But like so many official stories, this one starts to unravel the moment you look closely at the evidence. Because scattered throughout the historical record are photographs, documents, and physical artifacts that tell a very different tale. A tale of a world that was already electric decades before it was supposed to be. A tale of a technology that wasn't invented, but rediscovered. And most disturbingly, a tale of a systematic cover-up designed to hide the true nature of our recent past. Let's start our investigation in the most obvious place, with the photographs themselves. Old daguerreotypes and early photographs from the 1850s and 1860s show us city streets in remarkable detail. And when we examine these images carefully, looking past the horse-drawn carriages and the Victorian fashions, we see something that shouldn't be there. Street lamps, lots of them, elegant lampposts lining the avenues of Paris, New York, London, Buenos Aires. Now, the official explanation tells us these were gas lamps, simple vessels burning coal gas to produce a weak yellowish light. But look closer at these photographs. Look at the density of the lights, the brightness they seem to cast, the sophisticated infrastructure supporting them. Does this really look like primitive gas technology? Or does it look like something far more advanced? Here's where things get interesting. When we examine the actual physical lampposts that still survive from this era, many of them show design features that make no sense for gas lighting. Sealed glass globes with no apparent method for relighting the flame if it went out. Electrical conduits running up the interior of the poles. Mounting brackets designed for fixtures that look nothing like gas burners. These aren't adaptations made when cities electrified in the 1880s. These are original features cast into the metal, forged into the design from the very beginning. It's as if the lampposts themselves are crying out their true purpose, but we've been trained not to listen. The standard historical narrative tells us that before Edison's development of the practical incandescent bulb in 1879, electric lighting was essentially non-existent in cities. There were a few experimental arc lights, but these were far too bright and harsh for general use, suitable only for lighthouses and industrial applications. Gas was the only viable option for street and home lighting. But this tidy story has a problem. A big problem. And that problem is the sheer scale and sophistication of the street lighting infrastructure we see in mid-19th century photographs. Cities didn't just have a few gas lamps scattered here and there. They had comprehensive citywide networks of lighting that would have required enormous industrial capacity to produce and distribute gas. Let's think about what gas lighting actually required. You needed a gasworks, a massive industrial facility where coal was heated in sealed retorts to produce coal gas. This gas then had to be stored in enormous gasometers, those giant cylindrical structures that once dominated city skylines. From there, it was distributed through miles and miles of underground pipes to individual street lamps and buildings. This is not a simple system. It's a massive infrastructure project requiring enormous capital investment, advanced metallurgy for the pipes, precision engineering for the regulators and burners, and constant maintenance to prevent the frequent leaks and explosions that plagued gas systems. And we're supposed to believe that cities all over the world, from industrial powerhouses like London to frontier towns in America, simultaneously built these expensive, complex systems in the 1850s. But here's the thing. When you look at the actual historical records, the gasworks and gasometers we can document didn't appear in most cities until the 1870s and 1880s, the very period when electric lighting was supposedly being introduced. Before that, the infrastructure just isn't there. The buildings don't exist. The equipment isn't documented. The industrial capacity cannot be accounted for. So if the gas infrastructure wasn't there, what was powering all those street lamps we see in the photographs? There's another piece of evidence that historians prefer to ignore: the early electrical infrastructure of cities. We're told that the first electric power stations weren't built until the 1880s, starting with Edison's Pearl Street Station in New York in 1882. But when you examine old city maps and civil engineering records, you find something peculiar. Beneath the streets of many old cities, there are electrical conduits and cable runs that predate the supposed introduction of electrical power by decades. During renovation work and archaeological surveys, construction crews have repeatedly discovered electrical wiring and junction boxes buried under layers of pavement and street surface that place them firmly in the mid-19th century or earlier. The official explanation for this is always the same. These must be later additions, or the dating must be wrong, or they must have been for telegraph wires. But telegraph wires were strung above ground on poles, not buried in expensive underground conduits. And the gauge of the wire found in these mysterious installations is far too heavy for telegraph use. It's power distribution cable designed to carry substantial electrical loads. Moreover, when we look at the great buildings constructed in the 1850s and 1860s, museums, government buildings, opera houses, we find that many of them have electrical wiring integrated into their original structure. Not added later, not retrofitted during renovations, but built in from the start. Conduits running through walls, junction boxes sealed behind original plaster, cable runs that clearly predate any later remodeling. These buildings were designed for electric light from their inception. Their architects knew about electricity. They planned for it. They built for it. The mystery deepens when we look at what was happening in those supposedly primitive times. The 1850s weren't the Dark Ages. This was an era of rapid industrialization, of steamships and railroads, of photography and the telegraph. The fundamental principles of electricity were well understood. Volta's battery was already half a century old. Faraday had demonstrated electromagnetic induction in the 1830s. Arc lamps had been demonstrated as early as the 1810s. The idea that nobody thought to use electricity for lighting until Edison came along is absurd. The technology was there. The knowledge was there. The motivation was certainly there, given the expense and danger of gas lighting. So why do we believe it took another 30 years for anyone to do the obvious? Unless, of course, they didn't wait. Unless the obvious was done immediately and the story was changed later. Here's where our investigation takes a darker turn, because there's evidence, substantial evidence, that many cities in the 1850s and 1860s had working electric street lighting systems powered by a technology we no longer understand. A technology that was deliberately suppressed and written out of history. Look at the photographs of street scenes from this era. Really look at them. Notice the quality of the light in night scenes. Gas lamps produce a distinctive yellow flickering light with deep shadows. But in many of these old photographs, the illumination is bright, white and even. the kind of illumination you get from electric light, not gas flame. Notice also the behavior of people in these photographs. In cities supposedly lit only by dim, dangerous gas lamps, we see people out at night in large numbers, well-dressed crowds promenading down brightly lit boulevards. Streets are clean, storefronts are illuminated, and there's no sign of the soot and grime that gaslighting produced in abundance. It looks exactly like a city lit by electricity. And then there are the technical manuals and engineering, journals from the period. If you dig deep enough into library archives, past the standard histories and into the primary sources, you find articles and treatises discussing electric lighting systems in matter-of-fact terms. Not as distant dreams or theoretical possibilities, but as working systems in active use. These documents are never cited in mainstream histories. They're not reprinted in modern collections. They're buried in the stacks, gathering dust, waiting for someone curious enough to look. And when you find them and read them, the picture they paint is radically different from what we've been taught. They describe arc lamp systems powered by dynamos driven by water wheels and steam engines. They discuss the challenges of underground cable distribution and the development of better insulation materials. They compare the costs and benefits of electric versus gas lighting and often conclude that electric is the superior choice, already being adopted in progressive cities. This wasn't theoretical. This was documentation of existing systems, practical engineering discussions about real-world installations. And then, sometime around the 1870s, these discussions vanish from the journals. The tone changes. Suddenly, electric lighting is once again a distant dream, a future possibility, something Edison will eventually invent. What happened? How did a working technology with documented installations suddenly become uninvented? The answer, I believe, lies in the Great Fires. Every city that had electric street lighting in the mid-19th century suffered a catastrophic fire in the 1860s or 1870s. This is not speculation. This is documented fact. The Great Fire of London in 1861, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the Great Boston Fire of 1872. San Francisco burned in 1851 and again in 1906. Hamburg, Sydney, Toronto all experienced massive conflagrations that destroyed their historic centres. We're told these were accidents. A cow kicked over a lantern in Chicago, overheated tar boilers in Hamburg, random chance in an era of wooden buildings and open flames. But the pattern is too consistent, the timing too precise, and the results too convenient, because after each fire, the city was rebuilt. And in the rebuilding, the electrical infrastructure was stripped out and replaced with gas. The official story changed, the electric lights were forgotten, and a new timeline was established, one that placed the invention of practical electric lighting safely in the 1880s after the destruction was complete. Why would anyone do this? What possible motive could there be for such a massive, coordinated cover-up? The answer is control. Electric lighting in the 1850s wasn't generated by centralized power stations owned by monopolistic utility companies. It was produced locally by individual buildings and districts, using technology that was relatively simple and accessible. Water wheels, steam engines, and dynamos. Any factory or wealthy estate could have its own power generation. Any city could build its own grid without depending on outside suppliers. This was a decentralized, democratized technology, and that made it dangerous to those who understood that control of energy meant control of society. The late 19th century was the era of the great monopolies, Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Carnegie and his steel empire, the great banking houses. These were men who understood that the path to power and wealth lay in controlling essential resources and technologies, and electricity was going to be essential. But you can't monopolize a technology that anyone can produce in their own basement. You can't charge monopoly prices for something people can generate themselves. So the existing electric infrastructure had to be destroyed, and the knowledge of how to build it had to be suppressed. The Great Fires accomplished the first goal. The rewriting of history accomplished the second. And by the time Edison's Pearl Street station came online in 1882, the new paradigm was established. Electricity would be generated at massive central plants and distributed by monopolistic utility companies. The consumer would be dependent, metered, and controlled. This wasn't progress. This was regression disguised as advancement. A step backward masked as a leap forward. Now, I can already hear the objections. If electric lighting existed in the 1850s, where are the power plants? Where are the generators? Where's the physical evidence of this infrastructure? It's a fair question, and the answer is much of it is still there. We just don't recognize it for what it is. Look at the architecture of the 1850s and 1860s. Many of the great public buildings from this era have strange features that don't make sense if they were only lit by gas. Massive ventilation systems far beyond what would be needed to exhaust gas fumes. Thick copper cables running through walls and underfloors, too heavy for telegraph use. Mysterious. Mechanical rooms in basements with heavy foundations designed to support large rotating machinery. We're told these were for heating systems, for hydraulics, for building services. But when you examine them with an engineer's eye, they look exactly like the infrastructure needed to support electrical generation and distribution. Foundations for dynamos, cable runs for power distribution, ventilation for the heat generated by electrical equipment, and then there are the buildings themselves. The great exhibition halls and winter gardens of the 19th century, structures of iron and glass on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the 20th century. We're told they were heated and lit entirely by gas, but the math doesn't work. The amount of gas that would have been required to heat and illuminate these vast spaces would have created a fire hazard beyond comprehension. The consumption would have bankrupted their operators. But if they were electrically lit and heated using arcs, lamps and electric resistance heaters powered by on-site generators, suddenly the economics make sense. The technology was adequate. The costs were manageable. It actually works. The Crystal Palace in London, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, is a perfect example. This enormous structure of iron and glass, covering over 990,000 square feet, was supposedly lit by gas lamps. But engineers who have studied the building point out that the gas infrastructure needed to safely light such a space simply doesn't exist in the historical record. There are no documented gasworks capable of supplying the enormous quantities needed. No network of pipes heavy enough to distribute it. No ventilation system adequate to exhaust the fumes. But there are sealed conduits running through the structure, heavy cable runs, mounting points for light fixtures that look nothing like gas lamps, and contemporary accounts mention the brilliant white illumination of the interior, language more consistent with electric light than gas flame. The Crystal Palace burned down in 1936, and with it went much of the physical evidence. Convenient, isn't it? How many of these structures from the supposedly gaslit era have been destroyed by fire, taking their secrets with them? We need to talk about the timeline more carefully, because the standard story of lighting technology has some glaring holes that historians prefer to gloss over. We're told that arc lighting was too bright and harsh for general use, only suitable for lighthouses and industrial applications. But arc lights were demonstrated as early as 1807 by Humphrey Davy. By the 1840s, they were being used experimentally for public lighting in several European cities. The technology worked. It was just supposedly impractical. Then Edison develops the incandescent bulb in 1879, and suddenly electric lighting becomes viable. The The world rapidly transitions from gas to electric over the next 2 decades, and we enter the modern age. But this story skips over a crucial period. The decades between 1850 and 1880 are treated as a kind of dark age of lighting technology, a period where nothing much happened. Cities were lit by gas, and that was that. We're asked to believe that in an era of explosive technological progress, when railroads were spanning continents and telegraph cables were being laid across oceans, nobody made any significant advances in electric lighting for 30 years. Does that make sense? In an era when every other technology was advancing at a breakneck pace, lighting technology alone stood still? Unless it didn't stand still. Unless there was progress, rapid progress, but that progress had to be erased and the timeline reset. Let's consider another piece of evidence: the batteries. Large-scale electrical systems need power storage, especially if they're based on intermittent sources like water wheels that depend on river flow. By the mid-19th century, battery technology was well developed. Large banks of wet cell batteries could store substantial amounts of electrical energy. And we find references to such battery installations in industrial and municipal buildings from the 1850s and 1860s. Not as curiosities or experiments, but as working systems for telegraphy and, interestingly, for lighting. There's a documented installation in the Paris Opera House from 1867 that included a large battery bank described as being for emergency lighting. Emergency lighting in 1867, 12 years before Edison's light bulb. What were they lighting and with what? The official story doesn't have a good answer, so these references are ignored, dismissed as probably telegraph batteries, even though the scale of the installations far exceeds what telegraphy would require. The evidence keeps accumulating. Old electrical fixtures salvaged from 19th century buildings that clearly aren't gas lights. Patent filings for electrical lighting systems from the 1850s and 1860s. Newspaper accounts of electrically lit demonstrations and exhibitions. Technical drawings showing electrical distribution systems in buildings dated decades before the supposed invention of practical electrical lighting. Each piece of evidence individually can be dismissed: a misidentified fixture, a theoretical patent never implemented, an isolated experiment, misdated drawings. But taken together, they form a pattern of a technology that existed, that worked, and that was systematically erased from history. Why? We've touched on the monopoly explanation, the desire of industrialists to control a centralized system rather than allow a decentralized one to flourish. But there might be more to it than just economics. What if the electrical systems of the 1850s weren't just simple dynamos and arc lamps? What if they were based on principles and technologies we no longer understand? What if they tapped into sources of energy that threatened existing power structures in ways that went beyond simple market control? This might sound like wild speculation, but consider this. The great buildings of the 19th century, and indeed many older structures, have architectural features that suggest they might have been designed to interact with natural electrical phenomena. Tall spires and towers topped with metal conductors, elaborate metalwork that serves no obvious structural purpose. Curious symbols and decorative elements that bear a suspicious resemblance to electrical diagrams. Tesla, in his later years, spoke of wireless power transmission and the ability to draw electricity directly from the atmosphere. He claimed this technology was suppressed by interests who wanted to keep humanity dependent on centralized power generation. Was Tesla rediscovering knowledge that had been deliberately forgotten? Was he trying to recreate a system that had existed before and been destroyed? The 1850s might have been the tail end of an era when humanity understood how to work with natural, electrical phenomena in ways we've forgotten. An era when buildings weren't just shelters, but machines, designed to capture and utilize ambient electrical energy. When lighting wasn't a service you bought from a utility company, but a natural function of properly designed architecture. And if that era ended in fire and erasure, it was because someone, somewhere, decided that this knowledge was too dangerous, too liberating to be allowed to continue. I want you to do something. Next time you're in a city with old buildings from the mid-19th century, really look at them. Look at the street lamps. Look at the fixtures. Look at the strange architectural details that serve no obvious purpose. Look at the thick cables running through basement walls, too heavy for anything but power distribution. Ask yourself if these buildings really look like they were designed for gaslight. Ask yourself if the standard story makes sense when confronted with the physical evidence right in front of you. Look at old photographs, the ones from the 1850s and 1860s. Look at the quality of light in the night scenes. Look at the brightness, the evenness, the whiteness of the illumination. Does that really look like gas flame to you? And then ask yourself why you've never heard this story before. Why the evidence is always explained away, dismissed, ignored. Why the possibility that cities were electrically lit before Edison is treated as lunacy when the physical evidence supports it more strongly than the official story. The answer, I believe, is that we've been conditioned to accept a narrative of constant progress, of steady advancement from primitive to advanced. The idea that we might have had advanced technology in the past, lost it, and had to rediscover it threatens this narrative. It suggests that history isn't a straight line upward, but a series of cycles of rise and fall, of advancement and regression. And more than that, it suggests that those in power have the ability and the willingness to reshape history itself, to erase inconvenient truths and replace them with comfortable lies. If they lied about something as fundamental as when cities became electrically lit, what else have they lied about? The gas versus electric question isn't just about lighting technology. It's about the nature of historical truth itself. It's about whether we can trust the story we've been told about our recent past, or whether that story has been carefully edited to serve the interests of those who benefit from our ignorance. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The photographs that show illumination too bright and white for gas. The buildings with electrical infrastructure decades before they're supposed to have it. The mysterious fires that destroyed the cities that had this infrastructure. The documents that discuss electric lighting as existing technology, not future dream. The timeline that doesn't make sense. The gaps that are never explained. All of this points to one conclusion. The cities of the 1850s weren't lit by gas. They were lit by electricity. A sophisticated, widespread, effective electrical lighting system existed and functioned for decades before Edison supposedly invented the light bulb. And then that system was destroyed. The infrastructure was burned. The records were altered. The technology was suppressed and had to be slowly, carefully reintroduced in a form that ensured centralized control and maximum profit for a select few. We've been living in the shadow of that destruction ever since, paying for a monopoly on a technology that should never have been monopolized, dependent on centralized systems when decentralized ones worked perfectly well. The truth is literally carved in stone in the old buildings around us, written in the surviving photographs, buried in archives waiting to be discovered. The cities of the 1850s blazed with electric light, hummed with electrical power, and represented a technological achievement that we've been told never happened. Until we acknowledge that truth, until we question the comfortable lies we've been fed about our recent past, we'll never understand what we've lost. And we'll never reclaim the knowledge and freedom that was stolen from us in fire and deception. The lampposts still stand on old city streets, silent witnesses to a truth that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. Next time you pass one, touch it. Feel the metal, cold and enduring. Look at its design, clearly meant for something more than a flickering gas flame. And ask yourself, what really lit the 1850s? The answer might change everything you think you know about history